Yeah.
Welcome to another episode of Sustainability Talks, the podcast where we explore sustainability, innovation, and impact investing. Brought to you by ETF Partners, Europe's original sustainability VC. Today we're diving into the fascinating world of nature capital, and more specifically, rewilding. And to do that, we have a very special guest today, Ben Goldsmith. Ben is one of the leading voices on rewilding in the UK. He's been active in both conservation and sustainable investments for more than 2 decades. He co-founded and led sustainable investment firms such as Nattergill, Web Asset Management, and the listed investment trust Menhaden Resource Efficiency. Beyond investing, Ben has played a huge role in environmental philanthropy. He co-founded the UK Environmental Funders Network and chairs both the Conservative Environment Network and the Conservation Collective. He's also served as a trustee of SIF, and as a non-executive director at DEFRA. Ben is also the author of the highly acclaimed book God is an Octopus and the host of Rewilding the World, probably the leading podcast worldwide for the topic of rewilding. On a personal note, Ben is also a dear friend and one of the smartest, kindest, and most generous people I know. I'm really excited for this conversation. Let's dive right in. Ben, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Thomas, for having me.
I want to jump straight in and ask you, how does one become a rewilder, so to speak? So what got you into this space to begin with?
I grew up with a real fascination for nature and wildlife. I don't know that that's unique to me, by the way. I have a lot of experience with small children. I have several of my own. And you find me a toddler who isn't mesmerized by a frog with frog spawn or a bird's nest with blue eggs inside. Children are naturally drawn to nature, and I was, like all other children, drawn to the outdoors. So if you came to my family home in Richmond, West London, when I was a child, you'd have found my brother and me trying to dig ponds outside, which was always a bit tough because of the sandy soil in the west of London, or putting up bird boxes. We used to get up very early in the morning to go and look for foxes and badgers in Richmond Park next to where we grew up. And so it was really normal for me to take this love into adulthood. So I've been something of a nature obsessive all my life. And my dream was one day to own a piece of land in which I could bring back proper wild nature.
I want to help our listeners understand the topic of rewilding today. So maybe you can kind of help define what is rewilding, how is it different from conservation?
Yeah, rewilding is a relatively new term. We're probably a decade or a decade and a half old. And for me, it's a pretty broad term. There's lots of arguing over what it really means. For me, it's a broad term that implies restoring what we've broken or putting back what we've lost. You and I both live here in the United Kingdom, in Britain, where we've lost so much. There are so many species that used to be here which are no longer here. And the abundance that our ancestors would have known here in the British Isles is really beyond what we can imagine. The volume of fish in the North Sea or the English Channel, in the East Anglian fens, the skies used to darken for the volume of migrating birds in spring and autumn. Now, this abundance of the salmon runs, of course, were immense. This has been, to a large extent, lost. And rewilding for me is about finding effective ways to put back that natural abundance. And there are all kinds of methodologies and ideas that fall beneath that umbrella term. But the fundamental idea is allowing natural processes to direct the recovery of nature. So it's a more hands-off version of conservation. Conservation has traditionally been about micromanagement. So if we pick one species, say bitterns, which is a strange little heron-like bird that lives in wetlands and makes a noise that sounds like the boom of a gun, and they're very, very scarce. And the only reason why they've survived in Britain is because the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds micromanaged the establishment of restored reedy wetlands in East Anglia, and they effectively farmed for bitterns. And as a result, the bittern survived and is somewhat abundant in those landscapes again. And thank God they did, because we would not have a number of different species in this country if it weren't for that micromanagement with particular outcomes in mind. Rewilding is about taking your hands off and not having prescribed outcomes in mind. It's about allowing natural processes to unfold.
Fascinating. And many people would say that this kind of historical period you describe belongs to history because there were not a lot of humans back then. And in your great book, God is an Octopus, which I really enjoyed, you talk about uh, how a lot of people are kind of against rewilding, seeing it as a threat to traditional farming communities. So where does the truth lies? Is it really difficult to indeed introduce rewilding and also maintain modern life?
I never accepted, even from my earliest years, this idea that wildlife is something we experience elsewhere. We take a family holiday to East Africa or even down to Europe, and it's not something that we have here in Britain. That always felt an unacceptable idea to me. And if you had told me 10, 15, 20 years ago of the progress that the rewilding movement would have made in restoring missing species and, more importantly, missing abundance to our landscapes, I really wouldn't have believed you. There are a number of species that were absent on our back here: white-tailed eagles, white storks, beavers, wild boar, wildcats, pine martens, various amphibians and small mammals. The reintroductions to landscapes which are undergoing this natural process-led restoration have accelerated in pace and have really caught the public imagination. I don't think there's any reason why we should not expect more of our landscapes and seascapes, why we shouldn't expect natural abundance. And in fact, the diminution of ecosystems goes hand in hand with poverty, always. And conversely, when you restore nature and restore ecosystems, you bring prosperity. You breathe new life back into communities in those places. I mean, anyone who's traveled in India, for example, will remember that you can see and feel the prosperity as you even approach areas that have undergone restoration or protection. You feel it. They're engines of economic growth. And I think that there is a profound cultural shift taking place, not just here in Britain, but everywhere, in which on the one hand, people are growing used to the idea that we have terribly depleted our ecosystems and they want them back. They want to get closer to nature. They crave connection with nature. People are increasingly into wild swimming or hiking or these kind of nature connection experiences. The waiting list for an allotment on which to grow your vegetables is like 10 years in most councils in Britain. So I think there is this awakening as to the importance of nature and a growing yearning to put it back. And on the other hand, there's a growing understanding of the tangible benefits that nature brings in terms of prosperity and resilience. And so I think our economic system is moving in the direction now of nature restoration.
But in terms of this point about resistance, would you say there is a trade-off between feeding the world, for example, versus rewilding biodiversity?
So I think that there are three categories of argument against rewilding. The first is food security. People say we won't be able to feed ourselves if we prioritize nature in our landscapes. I would argue that the greatest threat to our food security is the breakdown of nature and the loss of such things as healthy soil, clean water, pollinating insects, and all of the other natural capital on which farming depends. But in any case, the National Food Strategy report that was published by DEFRA in 2021 showed that 85% of the food we produce in this country comes from just 20% of the land. This is the highly productive land. No one is suggesting rewilding highly productive farmland. They may be suggesting rewilding watercourses which run through that land. They may be suggesting adopting regenerative farming approaches to protect natural capital whilst producing food. But blanket rewilding is something that is suggested for the least productive landscapes in this country. And the same report suggested that the least productive quarter of the land produces less than 1% of the food. And by some accounts, it's even less than that. Some of these areas may even be net negative in terms of food production because you have to import feed for your sheep from elsewhere during the winter months, feed which is produced on better quality land. So the idea that our food security is going to be impacted if we prioritize nature recovery in our less productive landscapes, say our national parks, for example, is easily debunked. The second category of argument is economic. Well, these are some of the most economically marginalized people in the country, farmers in our remoter, less productive landscapes. The average take-home income of a sheep farmer in our national parks, which make up somewhere around 23% of the country, and they correspond perfectly with the least productive farmland, is somewhere between £6,000 and £8,000, which is way beneath the living wage, which is why the average age of farmers in these landscapes is pushing higher every year into the high 60s, early 70s. So the status quo of maximizing food production in landscapes which simply cannot produce much food is not working across swathes of the country. So there's no economic argument against trying something different, which is the prioritization of nature and the rewarding of landowners for the delivery of public goods, such as flood resilience, drought resilience, amenity, and all these other things, carbon sequestration, and so on. The third argument, though, I think is the most relevant, and that is the cultural argument. People are reluctant to change. All people are resistant to change, but especially those from insular, highly conservative communities that are far from the beaten track in these remoter landscapes. And in those places, I understand why people fear change. And that's a messaging thing, because the really dramatic changes happened when outsiders came in and cleared nature from the land and cleared many people from the land in order to make way for the sheep ranches that we find now in the British uplands. Ireland, Wales, the Scottish Highlands, also the English uplands, were all cleared of people in round after round of clearances by wealthy outsiders who wanted to fill the landscape with sheep. So today, those remaining communities cling culturally to sheep, but they're clinging to the object of their own original oppression. And in fact, go back 4 or 5 generations, communities in those places used to farm in a much more diverse way, had multiple income streams. They would have had native cattle predominantly, not sheep. And we'll talk in a moment, I hope, about keystone processes and why the cattle are so important. They would have had pigs. They would have done carpentry. They would have sold different products. They would have done a whole bunch of different things. Now it's a monoculture of sheep. The farming has always historically been very innovative. If you took the train across Kent in the 1920s and 30s, you'd have seen it was all hops for the beer brewing industry. The 1970s, 80s, it was all apple orchards and fruits. Now today, there's a lot of innovation going on around wine production and so on. So farming has always been very entrepreneurial, and this cultural resistance to change is the main obstacle that we face in the rewilding movement. It's a messaging thing. It's making sure that people feel in charge of their own destiny, that they feel that they can maintain their livelihood. They're frightened.
You've spent 5 years or so as a non-executive director at DEFRA, and you live in a farm most days. We'll come back to it. You're familiar with the area. What, in your view, on this kind of third point, what could catalyze farmers to move more quickly into diversifying from monoculture to multiculture, I suppose?
So England, and I say England because environment and agriculture policy in the UK are devolved.
Right.
So Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland make their own policies.
Right.
England is pioneering something that is a world first in relation to agricultural support. Most rich world nations provide lavish taxpayer-funded support to their farming industries. You know, the US Farm Bill is worth something like $70 billion a year. The 40% of the total EU budget is handed out to farmers under the Common Agricultural Policy. And these farm support regimes all over the world are largely unconditional. You just get the money according to how many acres you farm, or in the past in Great Britain, how many sheep you have. So the incentive, of course, was to fill the landscape with sheep, which is why our national parks are in the sorry state that they're in. If you visit any of Britain's protected areas, pretty much anywhere in the British Isles, you'll find a landscape completely shorn of trees, scrub, wildflowers, wildlife, birds. They had to invent a new category of national park, a level 5 category, just to accommodate British national parks. They're an international embarrassment, and it's because of these historic EU-funded subsidies for capacity. In England, we are pioneering a new system called the Environmental Land Management Scheme. So the old subsidies have been phased out over a 7-year period following Britain's exit from the European Union.
Right.
And it's been replaced with a new system that operates under the principle of public money for public good. So you can still receive public money. In fact, you can even receive more public money than you were previously on the proviso that you are delivering demonstrable public goods in return. We are now entering the 6th year of the 7-year transition period. And that's why you feel a little bit of a culture war going on in Britain around farming, food and farming. Your tractors lining up on the Mall,
Yeah.
and big farmer protests. The protests are not, incidentally, over the new Environmental Land Management Scheme directly. I'm told that 80% of farmers in England are now in the schemes. So farming has generally accepted these new schemes, and some of them are using it very well and have a better income than they did previously. The new Labour government has introduced a rule that ends inheritance tax exemption for family farms, which has caused big ruptions in that industry, and we won't spend time debating the rights and wrongs of that. But the new scheme is pushing farming really into two different directions. If you have high quality farmland, you're being rewarded by taxpayers for adopting regenerative practices. So, for example, combinations of satellite imaging, drones, and soil sensors in order to minimize your use of chemical inputs.
Right.
You know, if you have eczema, you don't soak your entire body in steroid cream, every week. You apply it with precision. Farmers are now being rewarded for experimenting with this kind of new technology and such things as no-till, where you don't plow the soil, or leaving stubble cover over winter, for example, to protect soil from erosion, combined with ancient wisdom, things like rotational practices, bringing in sheep after the wheat, for example, or pigs after the potatoes. And in the less productive landscapes, farmers are being rewarded for adopting wilder approaches in the way that previous generations would have farmed these landscapes. So switching away from sheep towards more gentle, more traditional farming with native cattle, who by their grazing and their browsing and their trampling will engineer the kind of diverse, semi-open mosaic landscapes that are the most rich in nature that we can have in Britain. The cattle are an absolute engineer species. And so this idea of wood pasture, as some call it, or rewilding or wilder farming is taking off because there is support for it. So there is a new vibrancy and a new spirit of innovation in farming, which is particularly enhanced in this country because of the new incentives. Because the fact is, as Warren Buffett famously said, it's only when the tide goes out you can see who's been swimming naked.
Yeah.
Well, in this country, nearly all farmers have been swimming naked, and they've been masking their losses with subsidy.
Yeah.
The subsidies are now gone. So in a landscape like mine in Selwood Forest, Somerset, which you visited so many times, farmers are now looking for ways to continue to receive public money, and the only ways they're finding is by protecting watercourses and adopting more nature-friendly approaches. And the less productive your land, typically the more you can do for nature. And so it's progressive, the new scheme. And I think that the scheme will pave the way for the breathing of new life into the economy and society of some of our most impoverished, most remote landscapes. I think it's an exciting time, and I think the rest of the world are going to watch what we've done in England. And I think ultimately that it'll be adopted elsewhere, this idea of public money for public good in farm support.
Can you kind of share a bit about this concept of living with nature and balancing urban life with biodiversity?
So there's a writer I like called E.O. Wilson, and he coined the term biophilia to describe the innate love that all people have for the non-human world. The reason why we love our dogs. The reason why people flock to the park the moment the sun comes out. The reason why people will pay twice the price for an apartment which overlooks a green space and one which doesn't. It's because on some level we all yearn connection with nature, with broadly defined the non-human world. And I think that E.O. Wilson is dead right. I think we have a visceral need to spend time in nature. And there's a growing body of evidence that shows this to be true. Hospital patients have been shown to recover faster if they can merely see nature out of their window. Prisoners, if they're given a few hours each week to grow their own potatoes, are less violent, less depressed, and far less likely to reoffend. And of course, anyone looking after children will know that all problems evaporate if you just throw open the door and take them outside.
Yeah.
They're especially hyperactive children like I was. They just thrive in nature. And forest schooling is now becoming a thing all over the world. Nature prescribing. The Japanese Health Service has pioneered the prescription of time spent woodland bathing or forest bathing, I think they call it. Green bathing. And they provide the cost of public transport, and you go back to the doctor and say, yes, doctor, I spent 2 hours a day in the forest, and they measure your improvement. So we know that there's something there. I think that our connection with nature is hard for us to demonstrate or articulate, because I think it's something fundamental to who we are, and I think it's ethereal. And certainly anyone who has suffered, and I guess we've all suffered at times in our lives. I suffered a deep grief following the loss of my daughter. Will know that nature is there to hold you when you need it most. And if you can, the first advice they give you, the grief counselor, make sure you're sleeping, make sure you're eating even if you don't feel like it, and get outside into nature as often as you can every day, no matter whether you can face it or not. Just get out there, because once you find yourself outside and you've got the soundtrack of nature around you, the bird song, the insects buzzing, this kind of gentle indifferent benevolence which sort of envelops you. And in my case, I swam. In the days after the catastrophe that befell my family, I swam every day in the bend of a river where you've swum many times, and where we have a pond at the bottom of the hill. And I went down sometimes 5, 6, 7 times a day just to plunge into the water and feel the hum of life all around me. It's essential. It's essential, the contact with nature. And it's just as essential for those who live in cities as it is for those who live in the countryside. The main reason why farmers fight to maintain their livelihood and to keep their life as it is because they love what they do. They love being outdoors. They feel this strong connection with, albeit very depleted, nature that is all around them. And the city is often the last refuge of wildlife. So I had this conversation with Sadiq Khan, the Labour Mayor of London, and we agreed in 2020 to set up the Rewilding London Task Force for 2 years. And so far we've dispersed £6 million to rewilding projects across the city. And if you walk in any of London's green spaces now, you'll find areas of that have been fenced out where you have
I saw that, yeah.
Bushes and scrub and blackberries and dog roses and habitat for birds to nest in. The watercourses now have natural reed beds, and the number of birds and amphibians and other wildlife in the city is on an upward trajectory, and including some quite amazing things. I mean, the Thames estuary is now wilder than it's been for probably 200 years. There are seals and dolphins and the occasional whale, enormous numbers of fish now, one of the richest areas for marine life in the whole of the British Isles. Enormous numbers of migrating birds pass through London. And so Isabella Tree, the author of the iconic book Wilding, really the book that triggered this whole movement.
Right.
She describes how important it is that we don't see a barrier between human space and wild space, that we weave nature through our lives, through our built environment. And you can do that. You have wonderful threads and corridors that are available for improvement. Railway verges, road verges, rows of gardens in terraced houses. You've got big blobs of green space. 25% of London is green space. Those big flat roofs, 650 hectares of flat roofs in London, which can all be, you can create these rubble roofs. You put spread out rubble with a bit of topsoil and some seeds. You have wildflower meadows, which make wonderful habitat up in the sky for black redstarts and other birds and butterflies and so on. And so this is all kind of happening now. And London is working alongside Bogota and Montreal and Mumbai as the 4 cities that are pioneering urban rewilding in the C40 group, which is the main city's climate NGO. The last thing I'll say on it is I spent some time with the young environment minister in Maharashtra, India. I met him in Mumbai. He took me to see where the leopards live in the Sanjay Gandhi National Park. And he said, I want us to stop thinking of Mumbai as a city with trees in it and start thinking of it as a forest with buildings in it.
Amazing.
And it's happening.
To switch to a more business topic of scaling rewilding, and I think we talked about it before coming in here today, how the concept of nature capital is kind of now gaining traction and is really the way to go to scale up rewilding. So maybe we can talk a bit about what nature capital is. What do people mean by that?
So historically, rewilding or conservation have been funded with philanthropic money. Generous philanthropists have been supporting through NGOs like the RSPB or the Wildlife Trusts or the US Nature Conservancy have been supporting the restoration and protection of landscapes and seascapes. And yet we depend upon nature for everything we have, for everything we do. And we sometimes see these figures that the value of nature to the world economy is 7 trillion or what have you. And the number seems absurd to me because, of course, the economy is subsidiary to the environment. But the truth is we have been valuing nature in all of our decisions. We've been valuing it at zero. And that is now changing. There is a shift underway in which people are starting to understand better what nature does for us and what that's worth, particularly in the field of hydrology. So lots of communities in this country flood, often very regularly. Some communities flood 2, 3 times in a single winter. And it costs taxpayers an enormous amount of money to try to prevent these floods and to clean up afterwards. More than 10 billion a year the country is spending on flooding. We now understand that on average during the course of a year, in a river catchment, only 1% of the water is in the river. And 99% is in the surrounding tributaries and streams and wetlands and soil. And so the best way and the cheapest way to mitigate flooding is to enable those landscapes to absorb water and hold it back more effectively, what they call sponge landscapes. So that is now being recognized, and it's described as integrated water management or natural flood management. And local authorities and the Environment Agency in this country, supported often by pension funds or the flooding insurers, are now investing in landscape scale natural flood management. So now there are a series of markets growing up which reward such things as natural flood management. Nutrient neutrality is a market for clean water. There's now more than a dozen nutrient neutrality zones in the UK where water companies are paying landowners to manage their land in such a way that the water arrives downstream cleaner and more slowly. So I consider the environmental land management scheme that we discussed to be like a big icebreaker ship. And in its wake, there's this flotilla of markets which are following up and providing additional revenues to landowners who are adopting a nature-friendly approach. We've talked about water, but there's also a growing market in biodiversity credits, a regulated market in biodiversity credits. Anyone developing anything in order to secure planning permission now must buy biodiversity credits so that their project delivers a net gain in biodiversity. And there's a voluntary market growing up now for biodiversity credits. Both Meta and GlaxoSmithKline and a number of businesses, SAB Miller, have said they want to be nature positive. Well, there's only so much they can do on their own sites. They need to buy credits from others. And so that there's a market now for measuring the uplift in biodiversity when you rewild land.
What is the driver for them? Why do they care? Is it a marketing thing? Does it impact their bottom line in any way?
So the regulated market is a legal requirement. Voluntary biodiversity credits are akin to voluntary carbon markets.
Right.
So it's somewhere between corporate philanthropy and marketing. But this is big spend. It's a bit like JD Sports investing in sports fields in low-income communities. It's companies like to engage with the community in that way. It makes their stakeholders happy, their staff, their shareholders, their clients. And of course, you've got things like the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, TNFD, coming down the line. We've already had the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. Right. Well, that's now a legal requirement in most major markets for companies to report their climate impact and to give shareholders a vote, or at least to disclose to shareholders what they're going to do about it. Well, now you have the same coming from the nature side of things. Companies are going to have to understand their direct and indirect impacts on nature. They'll have to publish it under the TNFD. And then, of course, they'll want to mitigate it. And they'll be able to do so much within their business on site, but mostly they'll need to buy credits, which some may call offsets. The methodology for measuring biodiversity is still not quite there. There are a number of different methodologies
right.
that are competing with each other. They all look to me a little bit like the methodology for measuring inflation. You take a basket of 50 goods that people buy regularly, and you measure the price at the beginning of the period and the price at the end of the period. Right. And the difference is your inflation number. Well, you can do that with biodiversity. You pick 50 species, common frog, nightingale, buttercup, and then you measure the abundance at the baseline at the start, and then you tokenize the uplift, and there are your biodiversity credits. So the buzzword in land management now is stacking. Now, how do you stack multiple revenue streams from the restoration of land? And this is what these very traditional, very conservative land agencies like Knight Frank and Savills are trying to get their heads around now. Because previously it was all about food and nothing else.
Right. And you spend a lot of time with pension funds, with insurance companies, with banks. What are they telling you in terms of what they want to see to back these sort of companies? What type of returns are they looking for?
You need to produce kind of mid-single digit, long-term predictable cash yields in order to compete with other similar asset classes like commercial timber or arable farming or student accommodation. You'd think that's all you need. A lot of these places are producing negative returns at the moment. And sheep ranches in the uplands, for example, are absolutely not profitable without government subsidy. Institutional investors have the vaguest of ideas as to what they want to do. They just know they want to do natural capital, nature, but they have not yet got their heads around what that means. And the kinds of deals they're looking at are sort of fair trade cacao production on the Côte d'Ivoire or something in developing markets, small deals, very risky. And it's hard for an institutional investor to do that. So there are some interesting strategies and sort of venture and kind of emerging market strategies that have successfully raised impact investment from institutional investors. What we're talking about at Nattergal and what we're talking about in this conversation is establishing something much more mainstream and much bigger. where large institutions can deploy billions of dollars into restoring landscapes at great scale, working with local communities. That's the most important thing of all of this, is that local communities need to participate in that, because what you don't want is a new round of clearances, which is their greatest fear, and which is completely unnecessary anyway. And all of this is aided by a whole new sector of innovation known as nature tech.
Yeah.
You've got Nature Metrics, for example, which is a British venture-backed star, a company which takes a thimbleful of water from a watercourse and can measure exactly what species are there in what abundance. You cut the cost of producing the Red List, which the IUCN produces each year to measure the abundance of endangered species, by 90% plus with that kind of technology. Or the combination of acoustic recording and AI to measure what bird species are in a landscape. And previously, you had people with clipboards and binoculars walking around for weeks. So there is a nature tech revolution taking place. The use of drones to plant trees.
Yeah, and also many of the companies that we see somehow feed into it. For example, our portfolio company, OpenCosmos. This is a satellite business that is being used and deployed by governments for many nature applications, and they can do many other things. But at the same time, the nature bit of things is really picking up for them.
Yeah, I think one of the issues is that people have a limited understanding of what nature is, even if they know they love it. And for many people, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, nature equals trees, which is a very shallow and often inappropriate view of things, and leads to this fear of communities that their landscape is going to get blanketed in trees. They won't be able to see in front of themselves. They won't be able to farm anymore. It's just going to be trees everywhere. And so that, I think, is at the center of this awakening that's taking place, a growing understanding of what nature is.
Yeah.
If we had walked out of this building 15 years ago and asked a random person about beavers in Britain, they would have laughed and said, well, beavers are a North American species. There's never been beavers here.
Yeah.
Now you find any random punter and they'll tell you not only that there's a European species of beaver that used to be native to Britain and which is now back, but that it plays a vital role in damming up the little creeks and streams and holding water in the landscape, and thereby breathes new life back into our ecosystems while helping to protect us from flooding.
So beavers became extinct in the UK about 400 years ago. And now we see, as you said, lots of beavers around and new legislation. What's the story about beavers? Why is it happening? And also why beavers are so important?
It's a difficult species to live with. They do things their own way. It's a very, very powerful engineered species, a bit like humans or elephants in Africa. They transform landscapes. And therefore they imply a loss of control. And that for British people, and in particular British landowners, control is a really important idea. And so the reappearance of beavers in Britain after a 400-year absence has created a cultural shift towards a more hands-off approach, towards the idea of giving another species autonomy over a particular part of the landscape, which is the watercourses. That's a radical idea. And it's unleashed, I think, a wider excitement around rewilding among the British public. And I think it's justified because beavers really are the keystone of all keystone species. The idea of keystone species comes from a medieval architectural practice where under each arch there was a keystone that if you ripped it out, the arch would collapse, which was a useful trick for retreating armies. And the same is true of ecosystems. All species have their place. Some are keystones. And beavers are keystones because they hold water in the landscape. The central desire of a pair of beavers is to have a territory of roughly 1 kilometer in length that they can swim up and down, because that's how they escape predators, by jumping in the water. So if they're on the lake or the main body of a river, they don't do any engineering. They just garden and eat the vegetation alongside the river and build their big lodge to live in and produce their babies. But those territories are few and far between. So when beavers find themselves in a small stream or creek which dries out in the summer, they're forced to work very hard to keep the water there. So they will build a string of dams, and they'll make that stream look like a Japanese series of Japanese rice terraces. It's amazing to see if you haven't seen one, and that's becoming more and more possible now in Britain to see these extraordinary beaver-made wetlands. And of course, they build their dams out of trees. So by cutting the trees down, they let the sunlight in. So there's sunlight flooding all over these extraordinary watery Japanese rice terraces, which then swell with life. Bird song, marsh marigolds, wildflowers, purple loosestrife, lots of little baby fish, and all the invertebrates in huge abundance. These are hotspots for life in the landscape. And they're also natural reservoirs. They're micro reservoirs. The average beaver territory will hold somewhere around 2 million liters of water, which is very, very important in terms of regulating and smoothing out volatility in the hydrology of our landscapes. A place like Britain that receives a lot of rainfall in the winter really needs that. So they're culturally transformational, but they're also practically transformational. And of course, wetlands sequester massive amounts of carbon. So restoring beavers back to a landscape not only brings back enormous amounts of biodiversity, it also creates this very powerful carbon sequestering patch in the landscape. So I'm very excited about the return of beavers to Britain and Europe. I'm a beaver believer, as we say.
That's amazing. So while on the topic of beavers, one place I've seen beavers is in your farm, Kenwood in Somerset. So while you're based in London, your real home is actually Kenwood. And when I first visited you there about a decade ago, it looked completely different from what it looks today. And it's a magical place, and I would say almost like a living organism. So can you maybe tell a bit about Kenwood Farm and your vision to what you wanted to become?
Yeah, I always dreamed of owning a piece of land, and I inherited some money. My father died when I was young. I got married young, so I bought this farm in South Somerset in my mid-20s. And initially, I had loose ideas that I wanted more nature there. But you're expected to farm if you have a farm. It never occurred to me that I would not farm. And you have guys with red trousers who are the local agent, the local neighbor, and so on, and they tell you in no uncertain terms that you're kind of expected to farm land in Britain. Even though this is very low productivity land, we're in Selwood Forest and historic Royal Hunting Chase that sits sort of between Bath in the north and Wincanton in the south. Kind of Frome in the east and, say, Wells Cathedral in the west. About 100,000 acre former wildwood, that was really only enclosed with the arrival of steam machinery when it became worth having a go at farming these kinds of unproductive landscapes. It was a wildwood. And when I arrived there, it was a pretty typical West Country scene, a lattice work of neat and tidy, slightly suspiciously neon green fields with very neatly cropped hedges and not that much wildlife. So I agreed I would plant some trees at one end because back then that's what we were expected to do if we wanted to restore nature. I just knew that you plant trees, trees equal nature. I didn't have a more sophisticated view of it than that. I knew I'd put up some bird boxes and build some ponds, and then we would farm in an organic and nature-friendly way the rest. And every year we lost money, but every year we got some subsidy to mask it. And then with the loss of my daughter in 2019, I lost my inhibitions and decided that I would do what I really love. And in a way, the rewilding of Kenwood has been a love letter to Iris, and it's a place where I feel her very strongly. It's where she spent all her downtime tearing about on her pony and so on. It's the place where tragically she died. And so we set about ripping out fences, opening up gaps in hedges, pulling up field drains, filling in ditches, inviting nature to do its thing in whatever way it wanted, with no outcomes in mind. And the only farming was this idea of the cattle and the pigs as a keystone species. So a very low stocking density of Old English Longhorn cattle, which are very hardy and they can stay out all year round. They're free to roam where they want, eat what they want, sleep where they want. We have some traditional breed Tamworth pigs that are also very hairy and very hardy. And so we produce a bit of beef, a bit of pork, but the stocking densities are so low that our production in volume terms of meat is probably 60 to 70% down on where it was when we were farming properly. But of course, our costs are now de minimis because we have no more inputs, no more in terms of, we don't need to bring feed anymore. We don't need to bring the animals in for 5 months of the year. The amount of work is way down. And the recovery of nature has been dramatic, as you said. We have hockey stick increases in all kinds of species, amphibians, bats. We're surveying bats, we're surveying moths. Our site gets a gold star and on top of the list for any of the surveyors which are regularly surveying on our land, which we haven't done as systematically as Nattergal is doing because we're not trying to produce any kind of biodiversity
But
credits.
do you have an estimation, like how many more species now live on the farm, or kind of number of
I mean,
animals?
So we have that data. I mean, 800% increase in yellowhammers. Species that were not there previously, like tree pipits and so on, lapwing, appearing, and we've created new wetlands as part of a local authority natural flood management scheme. And the beavers, of course, have woven this extraordinary watery wonderland along the bottom of the valley.
That's really amazing. So we talked about measurement. We kind of brought it up a few times, and I'm thinking of the entrepreneurs, the founders that are listening in. What, in your view, are kind of the biggest opportunities to build startups and specifically technology startups around nature? Or you've mentioned a bit like nature tech, but kind of what are some of the concrete commercial needs that founders should look at tackling?
So I think the most needed area for innovation is really in financing rather than technology, although it all relies upon technology because measurement is so important. So, for example, on my Rewilding the World podcast, I'm soon to be interviewing a guy called Robert Gardner, who's created a business called Rebalance Earth, and he's backed by the West Yorkshire Pension Fund. And he's developing a model whereby those private or public sector organizations that own infrastructure assets that get flooded regularly in a particular river catchment come together and provide an annual payment in exchange for restoration of that river catchment to make it less likely to flood in future. If further upstream there are more wetlands and more rewiggly streams and generally a more of a sponge landscape, then those infrastructure assets are going to have less downtime as a result of flooding subsequently. And they seem to be willing to pay for that. So then you get an institutional investor in who's going to put up the money for the restoration work, and they derive their repayment and their return from the money that's paid by those asset owners. So this Rebalance Earth model doesn't involve government at all. It's a private sector solution for building flood resilience into a particular landscape for the benefit of infrastructure asset owners. So that kind of innovation, I think, is really interesting, and that's where a lot of the action's at, because there's a huge amount of money looking to invest in natural capital. And there are lots of organizations that would pay every year to have greater resilience from the vagaries of nature, and who don't yet know how to do that. And the knowledge on how to deliver that kind of natural capital enhancement is out there, and the technology innovation is all over the place. So I think financial innovation is probably where I see the action to be at.
Do you see how AI can be applied in an interesting way to increase biodiversity, to potentially help project developers manage those assets of theirs, or get better MRV, better performance on the measurement, reporting and verification of biodiversity and carbon?
Yeah, I think to take the Rebalance Earth example again, I think artificial intelligence is a way to develop a much better understanding of which parts of the landscape are essential if you want resilience from flooding. At the moment, there's a certain amount of guesswork and old-fashioned hydrology. AI is undoubtedly going to be able to do that a lot quicker and in much more detail. And therefore, you can go to a specific landowner within the catchment and say, we don't need you to rewild your whole farm, but this corner here is essential because of the way the water moves through the landscape, the topography, the geology, the meteorology and so on tell us that this corner of your valley is essential if we're going to protect communities downstream from flooding. So I think artificial intelligence is going to be really important in understanding where we need to be rewilding. Similarly, in carbon terms, some ecosystems are dramatically important for sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. Take peatlands, for example. Peatlands are just 3% of the Earth's land surface area, and yet they store, I think it's a quarter of the terrestrial carbon. It's an enormous amount. So understanding which ecosystems we need to rewild if we're going to create nature-based capture of carbon from the atmosphere, which so far is much cheaper and much more efficient than any direct mechanical air capture. So I think, and similarly in the seas, we don't really understand which areas we shouldn't fish. There's a growing body of evidence that no-take zones are very important if we want to maintain abundant fish stocks, but we don't really understand where. And so AI, I think, with proper analysis and proper data, can tell us where we should stop fishing altogether, because that's where they breed, for example.
Well, the one interesting player that we see being quite active in both AI and nature is actually Microsoft, because Microsoft in the last few years is one of the largest buyers of future carbon credits, both engineered like direct air, but they do a lot in nature-based as well. So it's quite interesting that they see these two worlds kind of collide, really.
Exactly. And I think that's what will happen. I think nature-based carbon will be where it's at. But there are landscapes that aren't very carbon dense, but which harbor massive biodiversity. I mean, I went to Saudi Arabia last year and I saw the scale of their rewilding effort. It's a $1 billion rewilding effort annually, in which they've restored desert landscapes to the kind of savanna savanna grasslands that would have been there in the past.
Wow.
We think of the Arabian Peninsula as being sand, but I was walking through knee-deep grass with
Wow.
baby trees everywhere. And in the landscape that I was in, they've reintroduced 1,000 Arabian oryx, a species that was extinct in the wild 50 years ago. And numbers are growing very fast. They brought back 2 different kinds of gazelles, and their long-term goal is for those gazelles and oryx to be hunted by cheetahs and by Arabian leopards. So there's comprehensive restoration happening, but the carbon density, I would assume, of those arid, seasonal savanna grasslands in the Arabian Peninsula is probably not very high. And biodiversity credits may be a more obvious route to tokenization.
Are projects like this of really reintroduction, bringing the past into the future, are they challenged by climate change, by the fact that Saudi Arabia of today is just warmer than Saudi Arabia of 100 or 200 years ago?
I think so. I think so for sure. And in some cases, we're seeing proactive introduction of species to the north of their historical range in order to protect them into the future. North America has been doing this with certain kinds of seabirds and so on. But more importantly, if you build healthy ecosystems, which necessarily includes restoring species that are keystone within them, you can't have gazelles and oryx without a predator. They'll grow too great in number, and then they'll be overgrazing, and then you get ecosystem collapse again. So you have to have the sharks on the reef. You have to have the cheetahs, the wolves, and the leopards in the Arabian savannas. You have to have the lynx and the wolves back in the Highlands of Scotland to stay on top of deer numbers. If you rebuild those functional ecosystems with all their component parts, and especially with their keystone species, you are not only mitigating against climate change because they sequester carbon at varying rates, but you're also adapting to climate change and building resilience into those landscapes, because healthy ecosystems are very, very resilient, and they're able to protect us in all kinds of ways, protect our soil, protect our water supplies, to provide us with clean air, and just to protect us from the things that climate change is going to do to us otherwise. So that's the beauty of nature recovery as a strategy. It's both mitigation and adaptation.
I want to switch to a quick fire round. So I ask you a question, you give me a short answer, we go to the next one. How does that sound?
Great.
Mountains, forests, or oceans?
It's so hard. I love them all, but I'll take mountains.
Amazing. One word that best describes you.
Energetic.
Best piece of advice you've ever received.
Trust your gut.
A book that changed your perspective on the world.
Feral by George Monbiot.
What
made me believe in the idea of rewilding and ambitious nature restoration.
If you could reintroduce any species to the UK, what would it be?
Wolves, for sure. That's the hardest one to get done.
Right.
I mean, they're back in every mainland European country, and we need them back in Britain. Deer numbers are out of control, and they're amazing. And I think that harmony with wolves is integral. If we can't find peace with our old enemy, we won't find peace with nature as a whole.
If you could implement any environmental policy tomorrow, what would it be?
Have governments around the world eliminate all subsidies for activities which harm the environment, which mostly means industrial farming and industrial fishing.
If you were not in finance or rewilding, what would you be?
I think I'd be a landscape architect or designer. I love the idea of going to a family that own a piece of land and helping them figure out how to make it both beautiful and rich in nature. And I do that already a little bit, and I'd like to do it potentially professionally.
One simple thing that everyone can do to support rewilding.
Join a nature organization as a supporter and a volunteer. Give a little bit of time, a little bit of money, whatever you can, to a local or a national nature group.
That was the last one. Ben, that was a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for doing it. I enjoyed it a lot. And of course, for our listeners, if they want to find Ben's podcast, Rewilding the World, on every platform, thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Tom, and my old friend, for having me on your podcast. It's been a great pleasure, and I feel very lucky.
That was an absolutely fascinating conversation with Ben. We spoke about nature capital, rewilding, and we enjoyed it so much. Thanks, Ben, for being with us. To our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave a review. I'm Thomas Strikovsky, partner at ETF Partners, and this has been another episode of Sustainability Talks. See you next time.